Hi everyone, welcome to today's event on the University Greek play Classics in the Contemporary Moment. I'm really excited this evening to be joined by Dr. David Bullen, Dr. Giovanna Di Martino, and Professor Fiona Macintosh to talk about and think with the University Greek play. All of the folks who are joining us this evening have had some practical and some kind of academic experience working on and with Greek plays. So we're going to be able to think about something that's been a feature of school and university performance in the United Kingdom since the late 1500s, and also a kind of performance that's repeatedly been a site within which the categories of performance and the study of classics are publicly contested. Now, during the pandemic, the University Greek play has moved online and in these virtual iterations has continued to interrogate classics while responding to shifts and crises in politics, ecology, live art, and university education. So today we're going to have a kind of panel discussion. I'm going to introduce everyone first, and then we're going to get going with a bit of back and forth, sharing our experiences around some questions that I've kind of prepared. If at any moment you have a question or a thought, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box. We're going to do Q&A about kind of 5:45. So feel free to get stuff in there ahead of time and I'll kind of have a look at them, maybe feed some of them into the conversation as we're going. And then we're aiming to wrap up at kind of like around 6:15 latest GMT, if you're here with us this evening. If you're in a different time zone, good morning, good day, good afternoon, and wherever it is for you. Okay, so let me do introductions first. So Professor Fiona Macintosh is Director of the Archive of Performances of Greek and Roman Drama in the Classics faculty. She's Professor of Classical Reception and Supernumerary Fellow at St Hilda's. Before coming to Oxford in 2000, she was a lecturer in English at Goldsmiths College, University of London. Professor Macintosh has published a number of monographs and co-edited collections on the performances of Greek and Roman drama, including 2 free digital resources co-curated with Claire Kenwood and Tom Roble, 2016's Medea, A Performance History, and 2018's Agamemnon, A Performance History. Both interactive multimedia ebooks are freely available to download on iTunes or through the APGRD website. David Bullen is a theatre director, writer, dramaturg, and academic. His research focuses primarily on the interaction between ancient Greek drama and contemporary theatre practices, particularly in relation to feminist and queer approaches. He is the co-director of By Jove Theatre Company, and between the years of 2015 and 2021, he oversaw, guided, and directed the yearly KCL Greek play in London, King's College London. He is currently writing a monograph, Greek Tragedy in the 21st Century British Theatre, for Liverpool University Press, and co-editing a volume on Greek tragedy, education, and the UK classics ecology with Dr. Christine Plasto at the Open University, for Routledge's Classics In and Out of the Academy series. Giovanna Di Martino is the A.G. Leventis Research Fellow at the University College London, UCL. She has worked on the reception of Aeschylus's Seven Against Thebes in the US for her master's thesis, which is now a book, and is now working on her second monograph on the reception of Aeschylus in Italy from 1500 to 1960. Her current research projects focus on early modern translations of ancient Greek drama in Italy from 1400 to 1600, the reception of the classics during fascism, and the translation of Greek drama more generally from a practical perspective. She has also been involved in and led practice-based and outreach work on Greek drama and the ancient world more generally, including the Oxford Greek Play in 2017, the APGRD blog, and the APGR podcast 2019 to present. And she has acted as the academic advisor for the past 2 UCL classics plays. Maybe just a little bit about myself before we get into it. My name is Marcus. I'm a PhD candidate or DPhil candidate at Oxford with Professor Fiona Macintosh and Professor Felix Budelman, and I'm looking at the reception of tragedy in dance at the turn of the 21st century. But I'm also working currently as the creative director or executive director at KCL on the Greek play there, and along with Alison Middleton, directed Oxford's Greek play last year, which is a virtual version of Orestes. So I kind of wanted to start kind of broadly, but allowing us to kind of bring our own perspectives in here, just by asking, what is the University Greek play?
Would you like me to have a start, a go at trying to answer that? I think the official answer probably is that the Greek play tradition began in 1880, precisely in 1880 in Oxford, with a production of Agamemnon. In fact, I think if we drill down a little further, we can discover that Edinburgh got there at least 4 years earlier. And no doubt, if we drill down a little deeper, we'd find that there were plenty of antecedents. However, the 1880 production in Greek, and that seemed, at least in the early years, to be in ancient Greek, seemed to be the determining factor. And also we need to kind of remember that in 1880, that was really a moment when people felt they knew what a Greek theatre in Athens in the 5th century BCE looked like. And so that if you were going to put on a Greek play, you not only did it in Greek, but you also had to make it look like it would have done in antiquity. And so, you know, the amount of attention paid to reconstructing a Greek theatre in a modern space was extraordinary. And because of that, and in Oxford, and then subsequently in Cambridge, and indeed around the world, when people put on Greek plays, it attracted a very significant number of people, not just within universities, but also people, and particularly, I have to say, to the Cambridge Greek play, which began 2 years later in 1882, it attracted people from London who got on special trains out of King's Cross in order to catch the production of, say, in 1882, the Ajax, Sophocles' play, The Ajax. And they did that partly because maybe they liked the idea of hearing a play performed in ancient Greek, maybe, and very often because they were very interested in archaeology. But from what we can gather, above all, they went to hear the music, because one thing that occurred from 1880 onwards, and indeed also in Scotland before that, was that they turned to exciting composers, professional composers, who were very keen to try, as indeed, you know, from at least Mendelssohn in the middle of the 19th century onwards, to try and set Greek choruses to music. So that tradition dates from around about 1880 and continues, as you've already indicated, to this day, and in some cases without any breaks in that tradition. That's not true in Oxford. I hope that at least sets some kind of scene and context. But I suppose we also, just one other thing is, that's the Greek play tradition. There is, in fact, a Latin play tradition, and Giovanna knows much more about it, and she knows about it particularly beyond Britain. But at the Westminster School, for example, from 1560 onwards, they were performing Latin plays in school, and then not only Latin plays, but also particularly Greek plays in early modern France, for example, and especially in Jesuit schools, became a very important part of the curriculum. And we remember them not because they were maybe like the 1880 onwards productions, because they copiously reconstructed things, but because they were incredibly inventive and very often became the training ground for some of the most celebrated playwrights in theatre history. So we have to thank names like Corneille, Voltaire, you know, in France in particular. They actually played the part of, you know, a Greek chorus or a Greek tragic figure, and then became professionals.
Yeah, it was the idea of academic drama starting from the 16th century that really sort of kicked off. But I know that, and Fiona, maybe you know this, and you know a lot more about this. I know that for a time there was the London Festival of Greek Drama. Was that in the 60s or around? Was that later?
It actually began, I believe, sometime in the middle 1980s. And for a long time, the wonderful Nick Lowe, who's still very much with Royal Holloway and with us all in classics, and Nick, along, I think, with very much the encouragement of Pat Easterling, who was then Professor of Greek at UCL, they set up this really successful Greek festival because they knew that King's had their annual play, as David's going to, be telling us about, and that UCL clearly, I think at this time, began its Greek play. And what Nick managed to do was bring some of the most exciting speakers to the British Museum and sort of midpoint, and talked about putting on plays, more broadly, and also particularly themes around the plays that were being performed at KCL and UCL. So you're absolutely right, and I think it lasted probably until well into the 1990s. I don't know how much documentation there is. No doubt it is with Nick Lowe to this day, and many of us remember it and definitely benefited hugely from it.
Yeah, so that absolutely makes sense, because the classical play at UCL started around the same time. So it started in the 1980s, as far as I know. But I'm trying to piece everything together. So yeah, it was in the 1980s, and I should maybe add that it's the tradition of the classical play at UCL is precisely the classical play, not the Greek play. So it's never been in Greek, it's always been in translation, and it's never been just Greek drama, but it's been, we've performed both Roman and Greek tragedies and comedies. So yeah, I just thought I say that.
If I can just add a little about the King's play, just because that's the one I'm most familiar with. That tradition starts in 1952, and has really evolved quite extraordinarily across since that time. In the 70s, there are some legendary stories about it touring to the US, the productions that were produced. As far as I know, and someone may correct me here, but I think it remains the only annual university Greek play in Greek, or at least partially in Greek. It's for the most of its history, the King's Greek play has been wholly in Greek, but there've been times when it's been partially in Greek and partially in English, or indeed wholly in English. And in the last sort of say 10 years, it's sort of transformed again. For much of its journey, it's been quite a kind of I guess student-oriented, classics discipline-oriented affair. In the last 10 years, since it really transferred to the Greenwood Theatre in London Bridge, which is a kind of really fully functioning, professionally stocked theatre for 410 people in the house. It's become a play that's seen by about 2,000 school students across, not just in classics, but in drama, people studying English, a wide range of subjects, as well as members of the public as well. So it's sort of shifted a little bit as it's kind of grown. And of course, then, last year, the pandemic intervened, and so it transformed again, as did all of the plays. But I know we're going to discuss that in more detail in a bit, but yeah.
I'm really interested in the way in which already at the beginning, the Greek play is a site at which people are coming into university educational contexts from outside, professional music makers or theatre practitioners, and also it's a meeting place for multiple kinds of public, or multiple publics. David, just as you were describing, it's a place where school students come to see kind of enacted maybe something that they're studying, whether it be if they're kind of one of the few schools that study or teaches classical studies or ancient history, but especially if they're doing English or drama, it's a way of coming to see and ask kind of questions that I know kind of appear in these syllabuses of like, what is a tragedy? You know, how do kind of theatrical practice today engage with that, those questions? And so I feel like maybe we have an idea at the beginning that the Greek play has we can describe it as a long tradition, but it's always been quite flexible, as a kind of performance practice that moves between kind of students, academics, creative professionals, and different kinds of publics that come to see it. And given that kind of like flexible nature that it, you know, it takes a classical play, something maybe Greek, something from the Roman period, and kind of interprets it or does something practical with it. I wonder if we could maybe drill down into particulars, and if I could ask you folks about a kind of a particular example of a play that you maybe worked on, involved with, or saw, that changed the way you thought about university drama or the reception of Greek and Roman drama.
Can I just pick up before I try to answer that on about the widening participation point that you were making, which I think is really important, and maybe sort of remind people listening that yes, in 1880, if that's where we think roundabout then, this Greek play tradition seemed to begin. It's really important to remember that even if in Oxford it was a very male tradition, and in Cambridge as well, there were plenty of women in Girton College in Cambridge, not least, putting on Sophocles' Electra, but also particularly in North America, who and also schools in Britain, and I'm sure elsewhere, and actually in Australia, I know it's very well documented, where their first encounter with Greek, anything Greek, actually is through this Greek play tradition. So, and this was, of course, a time when, you know, women were not allowed to study Greek. Actually, Virginia Woolf talks about going to the Greek play and that changing her life and then making her want to learn Greek. So, I think in the, at least at the end of the 19th century, it was, and then in the early 20th century, it becomes a way of opening up antiquity to many more people, and in turn then often in quite radical ways changing the way people think about not just antiquity but also where they are in real time. If you forgive me, I now will go back to your question, which is really interesting, because I think a lot of us, and particularly people who work professionally by sitting in the audience, sorry, so, you know, who watch the play, sometimes, you know, going to a Greek play is not the most exciting moment. And I'm not talking about the Greek play tradition, it can be anywhere. One of my cynical colleagues said, well, the best thing about the Greek play is it's not long. So you but hold on a moment, there's something called the Oresteia, you know, you can, but it is true, it's not like Wagner's Ring cycle, even though Wagner thought he was, you know, recreating Greek tragedy. They are quite short. However, there have been moments, and for me with a Greek play, one really, really special example, and I think it was 2003, or perhaps 2002, definitely towards the end of the year in Oxford, and it was the Medea. And it was the most amazing production. And like lots of the productions I'm sure we can think about, the people in that production, a number of them have gone on to do extraordinary things. Someone many of us have worked with and are very much in kind of admiration of is Mary Louise Crawley. And Mary Louise was an amazing Medea. In that production, she went on and worked for 10 years in Paris with Ariane Nouchkin's Théâtre du Soleil, and is now a choreographer and a sort of scholar working in dance studies at the University of Coventry. She works with Marcus on occasions as well. And also, I think there's Paul O'Mahony, who's become a theatre director and someone like David, who works in theatre practice, but also interfaces a lot with academia, sort of straddles worlds. He was in that production, and it was so starry for a university production. And I know the great producer Thelma Holt was very much behind this production, and I remember her telling me that she said on the second night I called all my agent friends, you know, in London. I said, you've got to come down and see this production. And it reminded me of the first of, I mean, that's anecdote, reminded me of that 1880 Agamemnon. If we look in Oxford at the kind of the cast list, the Clytemnestra in the Agamemnon was played by someone called Frank Benson, and anyone who knows anything about, and David, I know knows a lot about this, early 20th century British theatre history. Benson was not only an extraordinary actor, but had multiple companies as actor manager, you know, started the Shakespeare Festival that became so important. And so in a way, his debut was as Clytemnestra, and indeed he's celebrated in a famous painting by John Collier. So it can launch your career. And in some ways, I think, for me, watching that Medea changed how I thought about the play, because it was so thoughtful and the chorus was brilliant as well. But it launched the careers, I think, also of a number of people who took part in that production.
Well, if I can talk about a very recent, much more recent production, which which ran just a couple of weeks ago. So it's Euripides Electra. I actually have a poster behind me, which is, I mean, you can't really see. Sorry, I didn't have much time to stage my background, but anyway, this is the poster, and then I know that a link to the performance, to the productions archive, is going to be put in the chat. So you can have a look at the poster in more detail. And but I just want to start by saying that what Marcus said is absolutely is very important. This link between the academic world, but also the teaching side of things. And I know we're going to get into this later as well. But the teaching side of doing Greek drama and teaching Greek drama, and the practical side of seeing these texts alive on the stage is essential. And I just want to say that the choice of Euripides Electra rather than other Electras, so other than Sophocles' Electra, which is the one that we actually see performed usually on the stage, came very much from a discussion that I had with my students in the module that I taught last year on Greek tragedy. So this is how much teaching can influence choices in the makings, in the makings of the play, even in the very choice of the play. Because I was talking about the 3 recognition scenes in Aeschylus' version of the play, and then Sophocles' and Euripides', and then at some point I said it would be really interesting to see Euripides' Electra performed, and to see all the aspects, the weird aspects of Electra, of Euripides' Electra on the stage. And that's when Zoe Morris, who's the director, kind of picked up on this and asked me lots and lots of questions about Euripides' Electra, and she was really struck by this idea that Euripides' Electra, and I think this is one of the many ways in which it changed my way of viewing not just Euripides' Electra, but Greek tragedy more generally. This idea that she was really impressed, or she was really struck by the comic elements in Euripides' Electra. So the first half of the play, actually the first half of the production that ran a couple of weeks ago, was really funny. It was incredibly funny, and it was really well done. So that, and you laughed all the way through the first half, and then the second half was completely tragic. So I think that was really interesting. That was really important for them and for me to discover in the makings, to discover like on live on the stage. And because we often think of, and this is one of the points of Rosa Andujar's talk. So she gave one of the pre-show talks before the play. Again, you can find the recording of this talk online in our archive. But she talked about the very term tragedy coming from a long tradition of German philosophers, sort of talking about tragedy in very as something that doesn't necessarily correspond to what tragedy was in 5th century Athens. So we have this idea that tragedy is something deadly serious, and you can't laugh about tragedy, and you can't laugh when you go to see a tragedy. So I think it was one of the ways in which it really changed the way I not only look at Euripides Electra, but also tragedy more generally, even though, you know, it's something that I do know about tragedy more generally. But I think seeing it was a very powerful experience. Yeah, and then the last thing was just that how much the translation that you pick can really change the way in which your fruition of the text itself. So the students picked Emily Wilson's translation of Euripides Electra, and that really, I think, did the trick of finally having a Euripides Electra that was funny and tragic and all a mixture of different things.
I think Giovanna's example, I was going to talk about something completely different, but then Giovanna made me think about another example that involves Electra, but also involves kind of contesting, I guess, what we understand tragedy to be and the kind of some of the presumptions around tragedy. So when I was well, first of all, the kind of, I guess, wider context for this is another vector of the Greek play, which is the kind of broader tradition of student drama, which, you know, Greek plays have been staged, Greek and Latin plays have been staged, you know, by university drama societies for a long, long time, at least since the 1970s, quite widely. And, you know, going back even further, you know, in the early 20th century at Bedford College, they were performing Iphigenia among the Taurians. The women there, Fiona was talking about the way that women were kind of using Greek tragedy to kind of engage with classics, and that's one example. When I was a student, I directed and adapted Sophocles' Electra for a student performance society, and that experience was, you know, hugely foundational to my understanding of how to make theatre full stop, but also about really about how it really taught me about how Greek tragedy works in practice, you know, in many respects, you know, how the kind of that structure kind of and the dramaturgy is realized on stage. So it was a fairly straightforward production of Electra, I have to say, for the most part. It wasn't particularly radical in terms of moving, you know, being set elsewhere. It was still set in Mycenae. It's still the kind of same plot, same characters. But the thing that I remember most clearly about it, and Giovanna, when you were speaking, kind of, this is almost a kind of counterexample to yours, was the fraughtness with which the fraught kind of encounters I had with various kind of stakeholders within the world of classics. As I tried to get this production on, I was called to a meeting with the society, with the society who was putting it on, to justify each use of the F word in the script, because we had devised basically, you know, a new kind of adaptation. And there weren't, I have to say, I think about 5 in the script. We had been really exploring this idea of Electra as a really kind of traumatized character. So we're thinking about the traumatic aspect of her language and whatever. So it kind of emerged from a kind of workshopping approach. we were sat there kind of having to justify every single uses of those words. And in fact, at one point, one student turned to me. These are other students, other classics students, right? One student turns to me and says, I don't mind the use of the word, David, but you've got to remember the ladies are a bit more sensitive about this sort of thing. Like, genuinely, I'm not even lying about this thing. This is a genuine thing this person said to me to my face. At which point the co-director of the project, who's now a lecturer at the Open University, Christine Plasto, she kind of, with completely deadpan, just proceeded to say, I effing don't mind it at all. So it was quite extraordinary to see the kind of not just presumptions around classics, but kind of presumptions around gender, around class, around that kind of seem to kind of exist around perhaps the idea of a classic text, and some of the kind of preciousness people might have around that, and actually how that production, which was just a university production of Sophocles' Electra, became a real site for contesting those ideas, and in the end, as a production, we were all felt quite radical. We weren't radical at all, really, but felt quite radical by putting the F word in the middle of Sophocles' Electra, So there was, it really kind of taught me about how Greek tragedy can become that site to contest those ideas. And actually that fed into a much more politicized production than we had originally intended. We fed those ideas further into our adaptation.
Hearing you all speak on this kind of question is really making me think about something that the Reimagining Performance Network is currently really interested in this kind of year of its running, is a question of practice-based research, practiced as research, and how in the kind of like context of a university Greek play that involves members of university teaching staff, and also kind of external kind of professional collaborators, how these kinds of plays can be moments both for discovery, for discovery and rediscovery. It's like not without a hierarchy, right? Because there's still within the rehearsal room a hierarchy of a lecturer and a student, or a professional coming in with a student, or kind of even students amongst themselves who have taken on different roles. But within that kind of system, there's room for discovery, like in your example of a lecture, of discovering actually that there is kind of a humor here, or want to explore maybe a kind of growing academic idea about what is the weirdness of this text and how does that kind of function. Or like David, like you were saying, that this is the kind of place where you discovered what the kind of dramaturgy of a Greek tragedy was like, in bodies in the room. And as a student myself, the King's Greek play was the first time I kind of really studied Greek tragedy in any way. There weren't kind of modules running on Greek tragedy other than the kind of introductory kind of lectures that we'd done a week on tragedy. I studied classical studies at an undergraduate, and then the Greek play was where I actually discovered kind of what tragedy is, and not only with classicists, with people doing classics, but with students in comparative literature, students in English, students in history and politics, who were also kind of rubbing up against this idea of tragedy or Greek drama in a certain kind of way in their courses and the way that they were structured. And yeah, David, hearing you talk about this idea of then a friction or a contestation that can be explored, it can be explored practically in a space, and then that people do kind of end up coming to see it. I think so this question of kind of practice as research or practice-based research, and Fiona, like you were saying, going back to this production of Medea, that this also isn't happening just within the university context, but then it's moving into professional theatre contexts as well. Maybe when people go on to then stage at the national, perhaps a kind of version of a Greek tragedy or a Greek drama, there's in some way a transition or a movement from kind of a discovery of what Greek drama is in a university context through practice through to the stage. So I was wondering if we could stay maybe just a little bit before we move on in this kind of realm of like practice as research, practice-based research, and the connection between kind of Greek plays and academia, or kind of Greek plays and the professional world.
Yeah, can I just jump in, and then I'll leave the floor to David, who I'm sure has a lot more to say about it. But I think that's why it has been incredibly essential to have workshop activities connected to the classical play. And I think it's an integral part of, and actually David came in and gave one of the workshops for the school students, for a group of school students, year 13 and year 12 this year. So I think it's essential that amongst the outreach activities that you do, that I do organise around the classical play, their future workshops, theatre practice workshops. So we had David coming in, and then Helen Eastman came and gave a workshop, and then so this was for the wider public, but also it has been. I think I spoke today with the director and the assistant director, Zoe Morris and Lucia Rudderman, who today about how the play went. It's kind of like a couple of weeks have passed, so we wanted to talk about it, and they were saying how much also the workshops that we organised for them throughout the rehearsal process were incredibly helpful. So I asked someone who's very familiar to all of you, Estelle Boudou, who's a theatre director and a dramaturg in France, and recently a Marie Curie Fellow at Oxford, to come and lead one of the workshops with me on the translation of Emily Wilson. So this is actually one of the first times in which classic students, and they were not all classic students, the actors were not all from a classics department, but the director and the assistant director were, and they said how much they enjoyed playing around the text, playing around the words, and sort of making sure, this is one of the things that Zoe told me today. She said that one of the things that she really wanted to make sure of was that it was accessible. It was an accessible script. So they introduced some of the some bits here and there in the chorus, whilst the chorus was talking and interacting with the characters. But they also cut some bits where some mythological references might not be clear enough to an audience who is not necessarily well acquainted with Greek mythology. So I think there's all these things that do help a lot, and do I think bridge theatre practice with academia and with teaching, which I think is incredibly helpful for me and for the students, and for the teaching of Greek drama more generally.
I mean, the text, I think, that is really brilliant on this. It's a recent book that I would encourage anyone who's interested in working with Greek tragedy, either from a classics perspective or from a theatre making perspective, is Zachary Dunbar and Steffi Harrop's book, Greek Tragedy and the Contemporary Actor. Both Steffi and Zach have such experience practically, with Greek tragedy, and much of that experience has been involved in a kind of educative context. They've worked with these plays in the context of universities or conservatoire training, where they've had the chance to, they haven't had the pressure, I guess, to have to produce an end product, as it were, that's going to get a big paying audience and has to sort of serve various different masters. They had that luxury to be able to experiment and explore and really get to know these texts, and their kind of distilled wisdom is in that book, and I think that's that really is practices research kind of made manifest there, and I think it's a really brilliant companion to anyone who wants to engage with this work. I think, well, the thing I was going to add in response to your kind of question, Marcus, was I think there's a there are clear, as Giovanna says, clear connections between education and the staging of Greek tragedy and professional and non-professional theatre making. There's a reason why plays like Antigone have been staged a lot by theatres. It's because it's on a syllabus, right? So they know, and this happened at King's College when they staged Antigone. We sold more tickets than we'd ever sold before, because of course it's not just on a classic syllabus, it's on a drama syllabus. So people attend. But I think those kind of connections go further than that. whether we like it or not, there are some, professional theatre is driven very much by networks, at least in London and in the UK more broadly. And lots of directors, for example, don't or will their primary experience might be training by doing student productions, often of classic texts like Shakespeare and Greek tragedies, and then going on to kind of apprentice as an assistant director in a theatre, or perhaps doing an MA at a conservatoire or whatever, or indeed, as Fiona said, with the example of Mary Louise going to work with, the Théâtre du Soleil or other companies. And so there is this real strong connection between an experience a director might have or a performer might have in being in, say, Electra or Antigone or Medea at a university context, and then when they come to encounter that again in a professional context, they're going to be bringing that kind of baggage, good and bad. I know Steffi and Zach start one of their chapters in that book by saying, every person, every actor has had the hypothetical lecture on Aristotle, Aristotle's Poetics, and they come with that kind of baggage when they're beginning to approach this material. And I think whether it's Aristotle or whether it's kind of experiences of playing a lecturer or being in the chorus or whatever at university, that experience comes to bear when it manifests in professional models. And I interview for my research assistant directors, actors, directors all the time from various different professional productions, and I'm always struck by how many of them have not quite formally studied Greek tragedy as part of their training, but know it from what we might call classes kind of student or amateur experiences. That's their experience with it, and then they rely on that embodied knowledge when they come to the room to and transfer that into a professional setting.
Can I just add a couple of points? And I mean, the range of sort of pedagogical benefits that Giovanna and David have outlined. I also, kind of observe all the time and marvel at. And in some ways, I think we ought to remember that the Greek play may seem terribly kind of alienating. I mean, why indeed would you try and put on a Greek play in Greek? And even, from 1880, people used to find it hilarious that the people who read Greek had the book open on their knees and read it during the course of the performance rather than looking at the stage. And of course, today we all, as indeed when most of us go to the opera, whether it's in English or whatever language, we read the surtitles, and that's what you do. But what I remember, Helen Eastman, who's been mentioned already, but who was, director, I think, of 3 Cambridge Greek plays where they bring in professionals to direct, which is very different from, KCL, UCL, and in Oxford, when it's all kind of student-led, even if there's an artistic kind of advisor, consultant and director, as David was and now Marcus at KCL. In Cambridge, there's a big, pot of money, and they bring in a professional director and a composer. And I remember when the first year, or one of the years, I think, when they did Prometheus, Helen Eastman told me that friends and colleagues, from the wider world of theatre were coming up, partly to hear the music, a bit like they did, back in the 1880s, because it was so exciting, but also they were really, really excited about the sound of Greek. And many of them said to Helen, and of course she's gone on to make lots of short, really exciting films with subtitles, making Greek, the language of Greek, just another language that we may not understand, but of course we can listen to, and with the help of the subtitle, surtitle, understand. And they all said to Helen, bit like many of the actors who've joined, the company to put on the production in Cambridge, they also aren't classicists, and they learn Greek. and these professional actors were saying, we want to learn Greek. Yeah, just like opera singers learn language to sing in languages they don't speak. So I think that's really interesting. And in some ways, very often, you know, we carry around with us a stereotype of, you know, both the person in the audience at such a play, but also I think thinking that it's just talking to a very narrow band of people, when very definitely it's not. And you know, there are so many composers, not least the one, Alex Silverman, who worked with Ellen Eastman in Cambridge, who are very, very interested in how you can set to really exciting contemporary music the meters of Greek choruses. So you know, the pedagogy goes in multiple different directions, and it's, yeah, I can't, you know, but enthuse and marvel at and enthuse about, you know, we should really cherish this tradition, because it is so creative and inventive, and it's really not I mean, in a way, as I'm sure all of you would agree, maybe we should junk this idea of tradition, and you know, think about something completely different, because if it implies we're looking backwards rather than forwards, then that's really not what, well, definitely not what any of you are doing. And I think particularly about what both David and Marcus did with the Greek play last year online, and you know, I'm sure you need to share that with everyone.
Yeah, I think that's the best moment to turn to that question of what then happened to the Greek play, or what happens, or what continuously now during the pandemic, and particularly over the last kind of year and a half. I mean, when Alison and I started working on the Oxford Greek play, it was in 2019. So, you know, we went through a full series of processes of transforming what was originally an in-person show intended to be on at the Oxford Playhouse into what it eventually ended up being, which was a kind of an attempt at an experiment of Zoom theatre. Not theatre put onto Zoom, but an experiment in making theatre using the techniques of Zoom, which a Zoom stage, you know, which we did not predict, you know. So I think now is probably the time to think about it, of what happens to the Greek play in this moment of it becoming virtual, or having to kind of throw away perhaps an idea of tradition, you know, altogether in this moment where we're kind of in new stages and new platforms working in new ways. So yeah, maybe I'll open that question up, and then if it's okay, in a bit I'll say something about the Oxford experience. But I wanted to the Oxford experience that Alison and I had working on it. But I wanted to open it up first.
Can I lead on that? Because this is still impressed upon my memory, the experience of having done this last year. So we did, yes, last year, the Greek play, the last of the Greek plays that I worked on at King's, it ended up having to be, we originally thought there was going to be nothing in that academic year. We'd have to sort of just have a pause on the Greek play. And then this sort of idea actually emerged to do something that was perhaps hybrid, and for a long time, or for a period of time, maybe about 2 months, you know, that period we had where we sort of thought that maybe COVID was getting a little bit better, and then we were off, you know, we were easing things back, and then suddenly we went back full on, you know. So we had this moment where we actually thought maybe we'll get into a theatre space and be able to broadcast live. In the end, it became a full kind of Zoom performance with all the actors performing from their homes. But what I really enjoyed about that experience, and I think it connects to some of the things we were talking about, is that Fiona, I completely agree. We should throw that word tradition into the bin, as it were. But at King's, you know, I work with really wonderful colleagues at King's on the Greek play in my time there. But because it is a tradition, it exists within that kind of idea of a tradition. There was, you know, when I took a project over, there was some hesitancy about doing certain things because of that idea of tradition. When I think in about 3 years into my run, we decided to bring in a kind of bilingual aspect and kind of perform some parts in English as well as in Greek. There was real kind of resistance to that initially because of the tradition of performing it all in Greek, even though that actually in the actuality of fact, the King's Greek play had previously had moments of being performed in Greek and English. But the pandemic and the need to create a kind of Zoom theatre, because kind of all bets were off, as it were, it meant that people, that we were given the sign off to just basically do whatever we wanted with this project, which gave us a real opportunity to explore things that I don't think I would ever be able to have done with that project. Otherwise, so in the end, it shifted from being a fairly, the traditional model of staging a classical text in some way, staging a Greek text, because the King's play it's never Latin, it's always Greek at the King's play. And actually, a group of students gathered together, about 15 students gathered together in workshops with me and Edith Hall, who was Professor of Classics at the time at King's, and then a designer, Nicola Hewitt George. We gathered together in sessions running up to the event, and essentially wrote a new play inspired by various existing Greek tragedies. And actually, at the table at the beginning, we put on the table some plays that Edith and I were interested in, Philoctetes, Euripides' Orestes, which I know you were doing as well, Marcus, at the time. So we put a range of texts that we were interested in on the table, Iphigenia and Aulis. And then, but actually what happened was totally led by the interests of that group of students, not just their kind of aesthetic interests, but actually their political interests. They were all really keen to, they kind of read these texts and thought, oh golly, these plays are full of young people articulating their dissatisfaction or with the world and kind of contending with an older generation. And so that thread became something that we pulled out and worked with. So the pandemic, strangely, and that online format strangely offered the potential to kind of throw tradition to the wind, as it were, and do something, not completely new, but new-ish in relative to the Greek play tradition.
Well, I think so. I'll give to you two of the consequences that I think lockdown has brought on this year's production. The first of which is that we were sold out every single night, and the matinees as well. So I think there's a hunger for going back to the theatre that has translated into the theatre being completely full every single night. So that's the first consequence. And the second one is that if you've seen the production, you might have noticed that it's a very minimalistic setting. And it's not just because of Euripides' own dramaturgy of the myth, but I think it's also been informed by Zoe's and Lucy's idea of coming back to theatre as a community. And I think that's what we really missed during lockdown. And that's what we wanted to come back to by doing a live production of Euripides' Electra. And we didn't do a production last year, but we did do something. So we decided that we wanted to do something on the Odyssey. So we picked the Odyssey again in Emily Wilson's translation. What we ended up doing was build a theatre, a living archive of the whole of the rehearsal process that did actually happen, but didn't end up being used in the end in an actual production. So we built this living archive that contains production notes, costume designs, and lots of different things. We also asked the wider public to participate and send us their contribution. So there are contributions from people not being in the actual production team and sending their piece, their reactions to the Odyssey. We organised what we then called the Odyssey Festival, which was a week long, and it was actually Fiona came for one of the talks, Fiona and Justine, and they talked about the epic, the reason why we have sort of gone back to epic retelling in our own time. So yeah, so you can browse the archive on our website, but we didn't do an actual production.
So we were intending to make Euripides Orestes for stage at the Oxford Playhouse when the kind of news came through and we went into lockdown. And really, I think the process of developing it for the thing that it is currently, which is a Zoom performance that mixed pre-recorded elements, so pre-recorded video footage, and I'll just put a link to that in the chat. Or also, I'll open up to kind of audience Q&A if folks have questions just after this, if unless people have things that they want to jump in on. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, folks, if you're kind of watching us kind of have our discussion, and I'll start feeding them into the panel just after we close on this kind of virtual moment. But it really, we Alison and I wanted to do Orestes because it's kind of a strange play by Euripides. There's so many characters, there's so many different kind of voices in that play, and we thought it would kind of reflect on the kind of current moment of people trying to figure something out while there's like a much larger crisis looming in the background, which we thought reflected something about climate catastrophe, the climate crisis. And then we were in the pandemic, a pandemic inflected by kind of the climate crisis and capitalism and everything. And so suddenly we had to think about what do we do with this idea that we had for a live performance. So we had a lot of failure. We had a lot of thinking that we could make a video out of it, thinking that we would try and do a partial stagings or kind of anything else. And I think we had kind of one moment with the production team, and luckily I think they said, actually no, let's keep going. And we'd kind of commissioned writers. So we commissioned writers who we were able to produce, again, original English translations. So able to kind of break out of the idea again, because of the conditions that it needed to be Greek, that we could do something different with it. So we had kind of 4 incredible translators: Antoinette Drakes, Max Watkins, Ina Litara, and Nicolette D'Angelo, producing work for us. And then we said, okay, well, let's make a vehicle for these translations. Let's make a Zoom performance that is kind of a fragmented version of like an already fragmented play. And really, it was because we had kind of designers like Etty Pin who were able to use kind of the Zoom medium in a different way that I think we were able to do it. And we experimented with form in that we had, kind of a comedy roast written by Alison and Ararat Amin, 2 kind of stand-up comics. And we had a live panel discussion integrated into part of the performance that Fiona and Edith Hall really kindly joined us for, alongside Natalie Haynes and Rosa Andujar as our like TV correspondents, who are like live on the evening of the vote as to whether Orestes and Electra would be put to be put to death. And we could also then have a scene that was a Greek, a memory of a Greek play, something that used ancient Greek and had subtitles. So we really tried to be experimental with it, and it's on YouTube now. And if you see it on YouTube now, it will look like everything was pre-recorded and then played. But we moved between people being on Zoom, talking as we are. But if you're watching this later on YouTube, we will also be a kind of recorded memory. But for those who are in the audience now, people talking as we are, and also videos that would get pulled up to kind of to do something of a kind of an effective chorus that. But it was so hard. It was so hard to do a production without actually being in the room with people. There are incredible people in that cast that like Alison and I will maybe never meet. But we spent hours together on Zoom in like 3 or 4 different time zones. And there's always that lag. There was always that lag between what someone would do on their end and then what someone else would see on the other end. And I think that we started to think, again, through conversations with people like David and Giovanna and Mary Louise, of like, what if that is actually the thing that is the part of the tragedy, is that ability that the people who are trying to speak to each other, but there's some gap that we can't kind of get through because it's being mediated or ghosted in this way. So yeah, we had a really hard time of it, but I think we worked a lot and worked collaboratively a lot to really try and think, okay, what can we do that is like a Zoom tragedy, or a tragedy of being on Zoom together, and using kind of different media for that. And we were kind of really proud of what it turned out to be. But I think it's also important to kind of contextualize it. This is like the last thing I'll say, to contextualize it within that kind of shift within the kind of Greek play that I'd learned from being at King's with David, of like introducing English, and also being at the time at Oxford, where Giovanna and Estelle and Fiona were thinking about practice-based research interpretations of Greek tragedy. So it's that like shift between academic stuff but meeting with professionals. But yeah, that's kind of basically what I have to add on it. And Alison sends her apologies that she couldn't be here with us today. But yeah, anything any of you folks would like to add? We don't have any questions in the Q&A box yet, but maybe if we give a kind of people who are watching a moment to type something in, could go back to you all if there's anything you wanted to add on.
I just want to say I really enjoyed Fiona's cameo in that production of.
No, thank you. But I was going to say, for me, it was surreal. Spending a Saturday morning, I think we were with Edith Hall and I, who hadn't had a chance to catch up, together with Marcus and Alison, and not really knowing what we were doing. It's a bit like that game sort of Consequences, do you know what I mean, where I remember it when you actually write a line but you've no idea what you're contributing to as a whole. So watching it when we finally saw was actually quite hilarious in multiple ways. So but I just want to say that all of the those extraordinary online new versions of this tradition that you produced at KCL, which I thought was amazing as well, and the Oxford one under extraordinary conditions. And I know how stressful it was. I watched it. I saw lots of sort of photographs, taken on phones of what it looked like in Oxford in our APGRD study room, putting the whole thing together, and just marveled. And I know how hard Giovanna's incredibly rich archive that you put together of your Odyssey project was. And so I, for those of us sort of senior members sitting on the outside, it was only fun. We didn't get the stress that all of you had, but I think everyone, and not least you, learned so much from that experience. And that was another way in which I think this tradition that we're not calling tradition was of such, such a learning experience in the very richest sense.
I will say though, while waiting for questions, is that it led to one of the more bizarre moments of my career when I was, for some reason, had to go to London away from home for when we were about to deliver the production, and so we had to do the dress rehearsal. I was sat in a Pret, and then giving notes to the actors in Pret, which would have, is an unusual thing at the best of times. But it's particularly given the violent characters in this play. I remember sort of coaching the actor playing a lecturer, or maybe it was Orestes saying, think about how you would murder your mother. And then the sort of person next to me and Pret kind of increasingly shuffling away as they're thinking, who the hell is this person? Should I alert the terror squad or whatever? Yeah.
Well, I mean, that if we don't have a question yet, I mean, I'll share with you something that I know some of you probably have heard of, but the first Cambridge Greek play was a production of Sophocles' Ajax in 1882, and the part of Ajax was played by Virginia Woolf again. It was her, one of her cousins, and it was a man called J.K. Stephen, who apparently, was hugely admired because he, exacted the revenge, that kind of frenzied, terrible opening scene when Ajax, thinks he's killing the Greeks who betrayed him, in his view, but instead slaughters the cattle. And Ajax, played by this man J.K. Stephen, some years later becomes the chief suspect for Jack the Ripper. So, another example, perilous example in this case of either life imitating art, or indeed people around them assuming, as maybe your fellow imbibers of coffee and whatever else you have in Pret, if they'd stumbled across your note and then imagine the worst that you were hatching in that cafe. So and I mean, I'm sure we all know there's so many hilarious sort of backstories to these Greek plays, but I think your Pret one is one of the best, actually.
I mean, there are a whole range of brilliant anecdotes in the King's Archive about various things that have happened. But I don't know if, Marcus, we've got a question before I start riffing from the secrets of the King's Archive.
Nothing's come through yet, so I mean, feel free to riff through the archive if you like.
Well, let me tell you my favorite story, which I think is very brilliant. Which is, so Euripides' Bacchae is considered at King's a cursed play, because every time they've staged it, most of the times they've staged it, something disastrous has gone wrong. And the one that I remember, because in the King's Archive, which has recently been catalogued by the wonderful Emily Patterson, there is this kind of a correspondence about this. And indeed maybe some viewers were in that production, I don't know, they might know this story better than I. I'm hearing it just from the archive, but the actor, the person appointed to direct the production decided to cast themselves in the lead role, therefore didn't, perhaps overcommitted, and they were playing Dionysus and had not learned their Greek lines, which anyone involved in a Greek play knows that is itself a whole, perhaps the main challenge of staging a Greek play is getting people to learn their lines, or learning the lines. And so he ended up writing his Greek on his thesis, so he could look at it. And then I think there's something happened where he put his contact lenses in while he had paint on his hands or something, and so he went blind temporarily. So, which I think perhaps was, I don't know, either sort of a Tiresias echo or maybe a kind of Dionysiac revenge. I don't know, Dionysus kind of getting revenge for desecrating his role. I don't know if you know more about this, Fiona.
I was in the audience in the second row, having invited someone along to this really exciting and edifying experience called the Greek play. And I mean, in some ways, it was one of the best evenings of our lives because we laughed so much. I mean, it was extraordinary, indeed. But I don't think, I don't think KCL, or King's as it was then known, King's College, was very pleased. And as you say, I think the best one can say is that the director had overcommitted. And was clearly, far too scared about telling people that it was absolutely not ready for anything. And not even for a wonderful reading of the comedy in Greek tragedy, because this involving, as you say, reading your script of a thesis for this, extraordinary god, it was so implausible. It was, anyway, a very memorable night in the theatre.
Well, on the note of the perils of staging Greek tragedy, maybe this is the moment for me to say thank you so much for our panelists for joining us. Unless someone does want to kind of drop a last minute question into the chat, just to say thank you so much for joining us to kind of reflect on practical experience of working on Greek plays, of directing them, of being in them, and also from the perspective of their history and their kind of continued effect. I think, there's the kind of continued conversation to be had about, exactly as you said, Fiona, about what the future of kind of the Greek play in the university looks like, how it continues, what it continues to like uphold or represent, how it can maybe continue, as we found out today, to contest some of the existing ideas about what tragedy is or what studying classics is, and can mean and can look like, and hopefully open up new avenues for kind of exploring practice-based research and practice as research in university contexts, and maybe even change the way we experience tragedy on our kind of national or fringe professional and non-professional stages. So yeah, just wanted to say a huge thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you everyone for kind of tuning in to watch the event, and thank you for the Reimagining Performance Network for hosting us, and especially thank you for Torch. Thank you so much to Nikki Carter for running the incredible kind of technical support and facilitation of our event this evening. We couldn't have done it without you at all. So thank you so much, everyone.